Hello and welcome everybody. In today's Lightroom video I'm gonna take this raw file right here and I'm gonna turn it into a photo like this at the end while showing you every single step from the very start to the finished and fully edited picture, while mainly focusing on the different lighting effects and the different dynamic, how you can create interest and also depth in your picture, all the way from the tonal curve to the local adjustments with dodge and burning. And I'm also gonna go a little bit into the color with the split toning and show you how I use color to get all of these effects as well. So as you can see here, the foreground is very dark and the background is very bright, and what I've actually done is to shoot this picture or this scenery in an HDR sequence with each one f-stop of a difference, so that way I have all of the foreground and shadow detail, but at the same time also have all of the highlight detail in the background. So what I'm gonna do is just grab all of these pictures and merge them together in an HDR, and what this will give me is a much greater dynamic range, a raw file with a much greater dynamic range, which I can then edit much further than any single picture, and also bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows while still retrieving all of that detail and not clipping anything. So we have the preview right here. Just want to make sure that you have auto align turned on if you shoot an HDR. That way if you move your camera just a little bit while shooting the different sequences, it will just correct that. And also because we have some leaves here and it was a little bit windy, I'm just going to set the deghost amount to low. So then I'm just going to click on merge and it will merge together all of these pictures into an HDR, and I'm going to jump right back once this is done. Alright, so now it's done merging together all of these files and we got a single HDR file, and because we did all of this in Lightroom we still have a DNG, so there's absolutely nothing lost. And as you can see here, we have a huge dynamic range from the foreground with the shadow detail all the way to the highlight detail in the background. So what I'm going to do at the start is just make this whole picture a little bit brighter and really first of all look at the foreground to really get a nice value here, because how it was just a little bit too dark. And I think around one stop, a little bit more works pretty well, but because the background then really becomes too bright, I'm just quickly gonna grab an adjustment brush with a minus about one stop and just brush over the background right here, and that way it just kind of equivalates the exposure out a little bit. This is just very rough at the start. I'm of course gonna fine-tune that way more a little bit later, but for now I think it looks pretty good. Then I think I'm gonna bring up the shadows even more so we have even more shadow detail, and I'm also gonna bring down the highlights by quite a bit. Then, let me see, I don't want to make this picture too dark because even though, I like this kind of gloomy overall style, I don't want to make this middle part be completely black without any shadow details, so I'm just going to leave that here. Maybe just add a little bit of contrast to get a little bit of a pop. And the whites are also very, very important to create dynamic in your picture. And as you can see here, without any whites, as I bring them up, it really creates so much more interest and differentiation in your lighting scheme. So here you can also press down the Alt key so you see a mask, and everything that becomes any other color than black means that this area then is clipped and there is absolutely no highlight detail in it anymore. So what I would just suggest you to do is just bring it down and stop before anything clips, and if it's still too much you can of course bring it further down, but around 45 here works pretty well. So that's once again the difference from before any whites to the after. Then clarity is actually a very important and also very tricky thing, because a lot of people will just go into the plus clarity, and this is not always the best possible option, especially if you have a very dark picture or a picture with a lot of leaves, a lot of texture. I actually like to go just a little bit into the minus clarity because that makes everything a little bit more simplistic, and compared to plus clarity or even zero clarity, I think it just works a little bit smoother and a bit better overall. Then vibrance and saturation, if you want to change anything here, go with the vibrance first because it adds color more subtle, more naturally, and the saturation really adds it in a very, kind of harsh way, so go first with the vibrance. And in this particular picture, maybe I'm actually just gonna bring it up a little bit, although there's definitely not too much needed. So real quick, from before any editing to after, it's looking a lot better, especially with the tuning of the highlights and shadows and how they work together, much better in the right picture right here. And of course I'm not done yet. I'm gonna go down into the tonal curve, and the highlights right here, what they will do is just affect the very bright parts in your picture. So whereas the highlights in the basic adjustments really just affect the kind of, very broad highlight-ish parts of your picture, the highlight slider down here will really just have an effect on the very, very bright parts. So in this particular case, there's really just some very few spots here that it affects, but if you have a sky or anything, it will do a much better job, or a much more severe job on adjusting that. So just play around with it. I like to go into the plus with almost all of my pictures, and I'm also gonna do that here. And the lights it's almost kind of like highlights, just a little bit differently. It doesn't affect it quite as broad, so just play around here as well. There's not really a set tactic that I have. And the darks is almost like the shadows, not quite as strong though, so I'm also gonna play around with this and just get a nice overall look, maybe just a little bit into the plus. And then lastly you have the shadows, which are also kind of like the highlight slider, just in the opposite with the shadow ways, so they tend to just affect the very, very dark shadows. I think I'm gonna bring them up a little bit, and let's see, before any tonal curve adjustments, here's after. It's definitely not a big deal, but it does fine-tune the image a bit better, and it definitely, I use it a lot to just make these very fine and very small parts of the picture just that little bit more interesting and more special. So once again, before and after. Then I'm actually gonna leave out the HSL tool. It doesn't really have too big of an impact on your overall color of the picture, so I'm gonna straight away go down to the split toning. And by the way, I didn't adjust the overall color temperature. That is because I think it's a pretty good color temperature. Everything to the right would be it would be too warm, and everything to the left would be way too cool, so I like it where it was. But what I'm gonna do here in the split toning, first of all, go to the highlights, just grab on this or click on this little box, and then I want to add some lighting. And usually if I add lighting, I want to go with somewhat of a mixture between orange and yellow, but in this picture I think I might even go with a little bit of green, and that is because the whole overall look of this picture is already very green with all of these leaves in the background and the reflection, so I think a bit more green would even work for this picture. But of course you don't want to add too much, otherwise you're really going to get a color cast. But just a little bit, around 30 here, works pretty well. Then shadows is not something that I use terribly too much, but in this particular photo, because there are so many shadow parts, I still want to play around with it. And you know what, I kind of like this sort of warmish look, but at the end, what if I go into the almost pinkish, purplish color here and just add a little bit of saturation so I can create some differentiation within the whole color of the picture. As you can see, before any, and even with just about 10 saturation, it really gives you a nice differentiation from green to the rest of the tones. And once again, I really like the greenish tone in this particular picture, but it's always nice to have some sort of differentiation. So once again, here is before any split toning, here's after. It definitely makes it a little bit more interesting. Then down here at the detail tool, I'm not going to cover any of this because it's pretty lengthy. I've covered it a ton of times already, and it definitely adjusts the details of the picture in terms of sharpness and all of that, but it doesn't really have an effect on the overall look. So I'm going to go down to the lens corrections, go to color, just click on remove chromatic aberration, so we'll remove any chromatic aberration if there happens to be any, and go into profile, enable profile corrections, just choose my lens, and that will get rid of the whole distortion that a lens may have, as well as the vignetting, in a pretty good way. Now here it's not too big of a difference, but what I'm actually going to do in addition to that is just go to basic and click on auto here. And because this picture is not fully straight, it is a little bit shifted almost, because I shot this not, perfectly in a line. So by clicking on auto here, it will just fix all of that, and as you can see from before to after, it definitely does a nice job with straightening all of the lines up here and also on the sides. So then let's go to vignetting, and vignetting is a very, very important part of editing, especially if you have a dark picture like this, and even more so if you have such a bright background and such a dark foreground. And the whole idea with this picture is to make the foreground relatively dark and really give you a graduation from the foreground into the bright background. So what I'm gonna do is just add a little bit of vignetting here, bring the midpoint a lot more towards the center, and also add some feathers so everything is a little bit smoother. So in terms of the amount, I'm actually gonna add quite a lot here. I think that actually works, maybe even more. Just around 40 works pretty well, I think. So here's before any vignetting, here's after. As you can see, all of these corners just got a lot darker, and in most cases I just add maybe 5 or 10 minus amount, and really not that much as I did here. But once again, because I want this foreground to be very dark, gradually going into the background, it really works here. So once again, before any vignetting and after. Then camera calibration, it does have an effect on the overall color, but at the same time, it's not as vital, and it's really just an artistic choice. And also, just play around with everything here. Once again, it's very different from picture to picture. So now I have a pretty good overall looking picture. Once again, let's just quickly show you from where we started to the after picture. And as you can see, of course, the whole lighting scheme with the different shadow tones and highlight tones is a lot more refined, but also the color is a lot more interesting, a lot more differentiating. So I'm gonna work further on this picture, now of course with the local adjustments after being done with the global ones. And the first thing I want to do here, once again, I want to have this graduation from the foreground being dark to the background being bright, but I want to exaggerate that even more. So what I'm going to do is just grab a radial filter here, want to make sure that your feather is to 100, and add a really, really big one just over this kind of background spot right here. And what I will do is go into the plus exposure and even into the plus whites a little bit, and really, exaggerate the whole lighting scheme even more, and really get all of this light shining on the walls. And the important thing here is that I really just look at the walls and the floor here, and not at the very bright background object itself, because I just make this radial filter to create some differentiation, to make it seem as if the light was shining into the tunnel way more than it was, and not to add the actual exposure on the very background itself. So I'm just gonna do that here. As you can see, I've added quite a lot, and if I show you from before that one to after, once again, just look at the walls, it really adds so much more differentiation, so much more complexity. So now that I've done that, I really like the look in the foreground and, in the middle ground here, but the background has become a little bit too bright. So what I'm gonna do is go to this adjustment brush that I've added at the start of this video, and go even more into the minus exposure. And once again, because we have a HDR picture from 9 different RAW files, it doesn't matter at all if we go so far into the minus exposure. It will not blow anything and still remain all of its details. So that's a really great thing about HDR. So I'm just going to refine the mask right here, also going into the minus adjustment brush by clicking the Alt key and just making sure that only the background area is actually selected. So then maybe even a little bit into the minus highlights, and in exchange a little bit into the plus whites. So I actually really like this. As an overall look, before we went into any local adjustments, let me just see here. Down there, this is it. So this is before any local adjustments and this is after, and you just see it's so much more dynamic. And it's really, you have to combine these different effects, for example, as I did here with the rail filter, with the plus exposure, then adding an adjustment brush with minus exposure in the background. You really, once you combine all of these different tools, you get the best possible result. So I like the overall look, and one of the last adjustments that I'm gonna do is actually add some more vignetting by grabbing an adjustment brush this time. Just go into the plus feather to 100 so everything looks very soft, and then just add some more minus exposure over the top here, maybe over some edges, and even over the foreground to an extent. So that way even more differentiation from foreground, and even, within the foreground, very dark, medium dark, even darker, going to kind of medium dark, medium bright, going to very bright in the background. And it's really a very, very dynamic picture. But the very last thing that I'm actually going to do is just add some dodge and burning with the rail filters. Dodge and burning is just making individual parts darker or brighter. And even though we kind of did some sort of dodge and burning already, of course, by making these local adjustments, I'm just going to add some rail filters with some plus exposure, as well as some plus whites, and just add them all over the picture and just kind of, make the whole lighting scheme even more interesting, even more complex, and just exaggerate certain spots a bit more. Then right click duplicate, drag it on another spot. Even if you just want to have a very small one to add, just the slightest bit of differentiation within a very small area, you can do that very easily. Right click duplicate, for example, maybe I'm going to add a little bit of a more strong one here on the leaves. I think that works pretty well. Right click duplicate, and just see where it works, where it doesn't here a little bit. Right click duplicate on the ceiling, also make this whole lighting effect even more prominent. And I think in terms of the plus exposure, that works pretty well. So now I'm just gonna add some last minus exposure rail filters to create even some more differentiation within the areas, to create some differentiation there as well. It's really all about complexity and dynamic and adding that, once again, differentiation between those light and dark parts of your picture. So in terms of dark, minus exposure rail filters, though, I don't think there's too many needed. So I'm just gonna finish it up with one here, and I think that should do the job right there. So once again, let me just fine tune that and show you before any rail filters at all. So here's before any rail filters, a lot darker. Of course, this big one in the middle is the main one here. And afterwards, it's just so much more dynamic. And if I just show you the actual dodge and burning that we've done, so disregarding the big rail filter, if I see that here, I'm just gonna go here. So this is before any of the last dodge and burning, and here's after. Not a huge difference, but it does make some spots a lot more interesting. So that was actually it. I think there's really nothing else that I want to do to this picture. So let's go here into the history and show you before any of the editing. Here's the start, of course, after merging all together into an HDR. And many people think HDR is just making a very artistic picture with a crazy plus clarity effect or whatever. But if you don't want that, then you can just use HDR as adding additional dynamic range to your picture, and at the end get a picture like this, which is once again a very close picture to something like this. Just the only difference is that there is a lot more dynamic range. So let's see here. Okay, so this is the HDR picture without any adjustments, and this is the picture at the very end. I mean, it's night and day, and of course you could fine-tune the colors even more with the HSL tool, make the green tones just a little bit different, and all of that stuff. But this was just a very kind of broad, a relatively fast tutorial, at least for my standards. And I just wanted to show you mainly the different colors, and even more so the different exposures and what you can do to create dynamic interest and complexity in terms of your lighting. Sorry by the way for saying dynamic 50 times in this video, but anyways, I'm really happy with this picture. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and of course by liking or disliking this video, this also really helps to see me which kind of videos I should do in the future. And if you really liked it, then you might want to subscribe for more Lightroom videos, Photoshop tutorials, and all sorts of photography videos in the future. So thank you once again very much for watching, and I hope you have a great day.